Okay, you weren't kidding when you said you wanted to dive deep. A whole consultation paper on Malaysia's proposed climate change bill. That's some next level commitment to staying informed. But hey, that's what we're here for. Ready to unpack this thing.
Absolutely. And let me tell you, just skimming this document, it's clear Malaysia is gearing up for a serious shift in its approach to climate change.
Right. This isn't just some vague statement of good intentions. It's a draft bill, the real deal. They're laying the groundwork for actual law, which is a huge step. And opening it up for public feedback, that's not just for show. It signals they're really trying to get this right.
Exactly. It really underscores the commitment from Malaysia's Ministry of Natural Resources and Environmental Sustainability, NRES.
Yeah.
They're basically the architects of Malaysia's climate strategy.
So if Malaysia is stepping onto the global climate stage, NRES is leading the delegation.
You got it. And they're not shying away from the spotlight. One of the first things you see in this document is a set of 6 ambitious objectives for the bill. It's not just about meeting international obligations like the Paris Agreement, though that's definitely a key part. They're talking about a whole-of-nation approach, embedding climate action across the board.
Okay, so less talk, more action. What stood out to you in those objectives?
Well, they're clearly aiming for a long-term strategy, not just quick fixes. We see this emphasis on providing a clear roadmap for stakeholders, setting concrete targets for emission reductions, and this is crucial, building resilience to the impacts of climate change that are already happening. They're thinking about both mitigation and adaptation, which is essential.
Makes sense. You can't just slam on the brakes. You also need to prepare for the road ahead. But to do all that, you need a solid game plan, all right?
Precisely. And this is where it gets interesting from a policy perspective. The bill emphasizes both rules-based and principles-based approaches. It's this intriguing hybrid model you don't see every day.
Okay, I have to admit, that sounds a little like corporate jargon to me. Can you give me the plain language version? What does that actually mean in practice?
So imagine a football game, right? You've got your playbook. Those are your rules.
Yeah.
Strict guidelines on formations, plays, when to pass, when to run. That's your rules-based approach, ensuring everyone's on the same page.
Yeah.
But then you've also got those moments of improvisation when the quarterback calls an audible at the line of scrimmage, adapting to the defense. That's your principles-based approach. It acknowledges that sometimes you need flexibility to respond to unpredictable situations.
Okay, I'm starting to see the strategy here. Rules provide the structure, but principles leave room for adaptation, which is especially important with something as complex and ever-changing as climate change. So who's calling the plays in this scenario? Does the Minister of NRES have the final say?
Well, the bill grants the minister significant authority, but it's not a dictatorship. They have the power to set those emission reduction targets, collect and analyze data, and even potentially dive into the world of international carbon trading schemes. But all of this happens with the cabinet's approval, so there are checks and balances built in.
Hold on, carbon trading schemes. That sounds complex. We're talking about potentially buying and selling emissions credits on a global scale, right? Is Malaysia really ready for that?
It's definitely a bold move, and signals their ambition to be a serious player in the global fight against climate change. The details are still being worked out, but the fact that it's even on the table is significant.
It's like they're placing a strategic bet on the future of climate action. And speaking of strategy, you mentioned that the bill gets into some pretty specific definitions. That's not usually where the excitement's at. What caught your eye?
It's all about reading between the lines. Remember that whole-of-nation approach we talked about? Well, by defining things like greenhouse gases, carbon credit units, and carbon dioxide equivalent, they're laying the groundwork for a comprehensive and consistent system. They're basically saying, this is what we're measuring, this is what matters. It's a signal to everyone, from government agencies to businesses to individual citizens, that they're serious about tackling this issue head-on.
So it's about setting clear expectations from the get-go.
Precisely. And speaking of expectations, they also get into the nitty-gritty of national targets directly linked to the Paris Agreement. This is where those international commitments get translated into concrete action plans for Malaysia. They're not just paying lip service, they're laying out a roadmap for how they're going to reduce emissions and build resilience to climate impacts.
Okay, but who's actually going to be responsible for steering the ship and making sure they stay on course?
That's where this new regulatory entity comes in. This is a big deal. We're talking about a whole new body solely dedicated to climate change. They'll be the ones holding everyone accountable, from monitoring emissions to overseeing carbon trading schemes to managing climate data.
Hold on, rewind for a second. Managing climate data, that doesn't exactly scream high-stakes climate action. It sounds like something you'd file away under Boring but necessary.
I know it might not sound glamorous, but trust me, it's essential. They're proposing this thing called the National Integrated Climate Data Repository, or NICDR. Think of it as a central nervous system for Malaysia's climate strategy.
Okay, I'll bite. What makes this data repository so crucial?
Imagine trying to navigate a complex maze blindfolded. That's what tackling climate change is like without reliable data. The NICDR will gather information on everything from greenhouse gas emissions and climate projections to the effectiveness of adaptation projects. This granular data will allow them to track progress, identify vulnerabilities, and make informed decisions about resource allocation.
So if one region is experiencing more severe droughts or floods, they'll have the data to back up their request for additional support?
Exactly. And here's what I find particularly encouraging. They're emphasizing transparency. This data won't be locked away in some government vault. They're talking about aligning their data management with global standards, making it accessible to the public, and encouraging independent verification.
Okay, now that's a breath of fresh air. Transparency is key when it comes to building trust and ensuring accountability. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, reducing those emissions. Ambitious goals and data are great, but how do they actually plan to make a dent in their carbon footprint? We touched on carbon trading earlier, but the bill goes a bit deeper, right?
They do. It outlines plans for a national registry for climate change, a crucial step towards participating in international carbon markets. This opens up some interesting possibilities.
So we're talking about companies potentially offsetting their emissions by investing in, say, reforestation projects in other countries.
That's one way it could work. But what's even more intriguing is the mention of a domestic emissions trading scheme, or ETS. This would allow businesses within Malaysia to trade emissions allowances with each other, creating a financial incentive for reducing their environmental impact.
Okay, I'm all for saving the planet, but I'm also fascinated by the economic angle here. Can you break down how this ETS thing would actually work?
Imagine there's a cap on the total greenhouse gas emissions allowed across all industries in Malaysia. Each company gets a slice of that emissions pie.
So it's like a pollution budget that everyone has to stick to.
Exactly. Companies that manage to reduce their emissions below their allotted limit could then sell their extra allowances to companies struggling to meet their targets. This creates a market where being environmentally responsible translates into a financial advantage.
So the cleaner you are, the more you profit. That's a win-win for the environment and the economy. But such an ambitious plan requires some serious funding, right?
You're absolutely right, and they've thought of that too. The bill proposes a national climate fund, a dedicated pool of resources to support these climate initiatives.
A dedicated climate fund. Okay, now we're talking. It's like setting up a trust fund for the planet, but instead of birthday checks from grandma, it's all about supporting a sustainable future. Where is this influx of cash coming from?
Well, they're looking at a multi-pronged approach, tapping into both domestic and international resources. We're talking about allocating funds from the national budget revenue generated through carbon trading activities and potentially even attracting international financing and donations.
So they're not just dipping their toes in the water, they're diving headfirst into climate finance. But we've all heard stories about well-intentioned funds getting lost in a bureaucratic maze. How can they ensure this money actually reaches the right places and has a tangible impact?
That's where their focus on transparency and accountability comes in again. The bill emphasizes clear eligibility criteria for projects seeking funding, regular reporting on how the money is being used, and aligning their financial reporting with international standards.
So no shady backroom deals everything out in the open. I like the sound of that. But even with the best intentions and a mountain of cash, you need a way to make sure everyone plays by the rules. What happens when someone tries to pull a fast one?
That's where the rubber really meets the road. The bill outlines a two-pronged approach to compliance and enforcement, incentives and penalties.
Okay, so a carrot and stick approach to saving the planet. I'm listening.
Exactly. On one hand, they're incentivizing good behavior through capacity-building programs and financial support for businesses and organizations implementing climate-friendly practices. It's about rewarding innovation and making it easier to choose the sustainable path.
But what about those who choose to ignore the guidelines? Are we talking a slap on the wrist or something more impactful?
They're definitely not messing around. The bill outlines a range of penalties, including hefty fines and even potential imprisonment for the most egregious violations. They're making it clear that environmental negligence has consequences.
It's a strong message. Protecting the environment is a collective responsibility, and those who don't get with the program will be held accountable. And to make sure these measures have teeth, The regulatory entity and other enforcement bodies will need the authority to investigate and prosecute offenders. Is that addressed in the bill?
Absolutely. They've covered the legal side of things as well, ensuring enforcement officers have the protection and resources they need to do their jobs effectively.
So it seems like they've really thought this through from the big picture strategy down to the legal nuts and bolts. It's impressive.
It's definitely a comprehensive piece of legislation. And remember, this is just the draft version. It's going through public consultation right now, so there's still time for feedback and revisions.
Which is fantastic. It shows that they're open to input and committed to getting this right. We've only just scratched the surface here, but hopefully this deep dive has given you a taste of Malaysia's ambition and the potential of this climate change bill.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating glimpse into the future of climate action, not just for Malaysia, but potentially for the entire region.
Yeah.
What happens here could have ripple effects across Southeast Asia and beyond.
It's a reminder that even with a challenge as monumental as climate change, every step towards a solution counts. And who knows, maybe this will inspire other nations to up their game as well. For anyone wanting to explore the intricacies of this bill themselves, we'll be sure to include a link to the full consultation document in the show notes.
It's an insightful read, even if you only have time to skim the key sections.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Malaysia's climate change bill. We hope you found it informative, engaging, and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Until next time.